This portion of the lecture is going to focus on the domestic effects of the war. And the first thing that we'll talk about, which we've already talked about a little bit in class, is the idea of propaganda, essentially selling the war to the population. This propaganda essentially sort of ignites a patriotic fever in the country. President Wilson saw home front support as crucial to any kind of military success, and the administration drew on the new professions of advertising and public relations in order to ignite that sort of support. They conducted things like bond drives for Liberty loans, which we saw several posters encouraging the purchase of Liberty loans. And all of these loans basically serve to finance about 2/3 of the $35.5 billion cost of the war. You have posters kind of like the one you see here, urging people to buy up either Liberty loans or thrift stamps, as the poster here indicates. Thrift stamps were directed at school children for the most part. And you would have popular things to try and drum up support. They had parades featuring flags and banners and marching bands. Popular celebrities like Charlie Chaplin and others worked to promote the cause of buying Liberty loans or thrift stamps. Patriotic war songs were written and reached people through the recordings of records, which they could play on their gramophones. And all of this also includes a kind of coercion, or I mentioned, or I described them as guilt trips whenever we talked about it in class. The balance of the government's war costs, sort of going back to that briefly, was mostly made up from taxes. Congress imposed wartime income taxes that reached as high as 70% at the top level. And so about 2/3 came from war bonds, the rest of it came from taxes. The government also created an institution called the Committee on Public Information, which basically ran the government wartime propaganda machine. It was headed by a journalist called George Creel, and while they claimed to merely be reporting facts, they usually reported the official version of events, which may or may not have been entirely accurate. And they tended to actively discredit anyone who would question the official version of events. They wrote propaganda releases that appeared in the news. Popular magazines published their ads warning of things like spies and saboteurs, and anyone who spreads pessimistic stories or cries for peace was to be suspect. Theaters screened CPI films, like the ones that we saw, the German defeat poster where it was played in 6 episodes. We saw a few of those posters in class. They played upon basic fears that the German enemy posed a direct threat to home, family, and American values. And you can kind of see that in the poster on this slide, where it exhorts people to save your child from autocracy and poverty, which are the exact opposite of American values. And so attempting to put some sort of fear into everyone's minds. The CPI also poured foreign language pamphlets into immigrant neighborhoods to try and drum up support from that sector. They also attacked groups like the socialists, who were generally actively against the war. They saw the war as a kind of capitalist crusade. Teachers, writers, editors, religious leaders all overwhelmingly supported the war, and they made sure that the message was conveyed to their generally captive audiences. Progressive reformers who applauded Wilson's domestic program now also cheered his war activities. The education reformer John Dewey endorsed the war in a series of essays, saying that progressive intellectuals had to accept the reality and shape it towards a positive social goal. The government's wartime activism, he said, could be channeled to reform purposes when peace returned. And so you drum up a lot of support on that end. That also gets a counter argument, which we'll discuss later in the presentation. Very interestingly, during the First World War, you have a huge amount of intolerance directed largely at Germans, although to some extent at Italians in America as well. And a lot of this was in response to the massive propaganda that was being pumped out by government sources. And so Americans reacted to that and lashed out at anything that was German. Libraries banished German books. Towns with German names would change them to something more American and patriotic. Some restaurant menus began replacing German food items like hamburgers with a new name, Liberty sandwiches. Things like sauerkraut was renamed Victory Cabbage, which isn't a terribly new practice. I don't know if any of you would remember any of this since you're probably too young, but around the time that we began going to war in Iraq, not too long ago, in 2001, the French declined to help us, and so there was a movement to rename things like French fries into freedom fries. And so this is the same kind of idea that you get in the First World War as well, with the German Victory Cabbage and Liberty sandwiches. Some symphony orchestras also made a move against Germans. The Boston Symphony Orchestra actually dismissed its German-born conductor, and I believe that it is probably him that the cartoon is aimed at, depicting the rather noble death of an American soldier in no man's land and the rather sort of pompous and comfortable-looking German conductor in front of the symphony there. The Philadelphia Orchestra even went so far as to ban all German music since Brahms. So the earlier German music was allowable, but anything more recent was completely taken off of their repertoire. Zealots also targeted American citizens who were suspected of having pro-German or anti-war sentiments. Some of them were forced to kiss the flag or recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And one woman in particular from Ohio, who was accused of disloyalty, was wrapped in the flag, marched to a bank, and made to buy a war bond. Anyone who actively spoke out against the war generally met with a fair amount of suppression of those views. One instance, which is described in Bisbee, Arizona, in July of 1917, details 2,000 armed vigilantes moving in against striking copper miners who all belonged to the Industrial Workers of the World, who was generally an anti-war organization. They bundled them all up onto a freight train and dumped them in the middle of the New Mexico desert without any kind of water or shelter. It was completely allowed. Theodore Roosevelt responding that the men who were deported from Bisbee were bent on destruction and murder, obviously because they were striking. And so that's the kind of thing that you start to see, a lot of it, like you say, inspired by this propaganda that's coming out from the government itself. One New York newspaper advised direct action similar to that against war opponents, adding that you do not require any official authority. The only badge you need is your patriotic fervor. And so that incites quite a lot of violence against anyone who would object to the war. Despite this kind of persecution, though, a lot of Americans persisted in their opposition to the war. Some of them had some kind of sentimental or ancestral tie to Germany. Others were religious pacifists, like Quakers or Mennonites, who didn't like war, period, regardless of why it was being fought. Of about 65,000... There were about 65,000 men who registered for the draft as conscientious objectors, so people who objected to war generally, but were doing their duty as citizens and registering for the draft. These people, if they were drafted, were generally assigned to non-combat duty, often on military bases, or if they were at the front lines, they served as military person, or not military, but medical personnel, so stretcher bearers and things like that. They often experienced fairly harsh treatment from anyone who saw them quite often as cowards, as you might recall from the song that we are at least going to listen to on Tuesday. It's in the future as I'm recording this, and possibly in the future as you're watching this. But we'll listen to a song aimed at conscientious objectors, calling them all cowards. At least anyone who rejected this sort of alternative positions, you can either have non-combat duty in the military, or you can go to prison if you're drafted and refuse to report. Socialist leaders like Eugene V. Debs denounced the war as a capitalist struggle for markets, with the soldiers as cannon fodder. And so they objected to the war on that front. Other socialists, though, supported it, so this served to divide the socialist movement. You also see similar division in the women's movement. Beyond the ranks of the conscientious objectors, you also have a fair number of draft dodgers. So of 3.6 million young men who were required to register for the draft, about 2.4 million failed to do so. Others who did register when they were drafted didn't report to their draft boards. Others of them deserted from training camps. The South generally saw very high levels of draft resistance, especially in the rural South. African Americans had added reasons to oppose the draft. Southern blacks who registered were drafted about a third as often, in contrast to whites who were only drafted about a quarter as often. And so you have a higher proportion of Southern blacks who are being drafted, even if their numbers are smaller. The justification for this frequency of drafting was that black families could more easily spare a breadwinner because it requires more for a white man and his wife to live than it does for a black man and his wife, due to their respective stations in life, so an inherently racist argument. Racial bias also worked in terribly complex ways. Some Southern whites who feared arming black soldiers opposed the draft, or the drafting of black soldiers anyways, on that sort of fundamental ground. I mentioned before John Dewey's urgence that you could take the war and put a progressive reform spin on it. That received a challenge from another journalist, Randolph Bourne, who argues that if the war is too strong to prevent, then how can you expect it to be weak enough for you to mold it to your liberal purposes, which is, I think, perhaps a very good question. This same level of wartime intolerance surfaced in federal laws as well, as sort of vigilante justice. The federal government passes the Espionage Act in June of 1917, which set fines and prison sentences for any variety of loosely defined anti-war activities. Eventually added to that is the Sedition Amendment in May of 1918, which imposed stiff penalties on anyone convicted of using disloyal, profane, or abusive language about either the government, the Constitution, the flag, or the military. These laws were used pretty intensively to oppress any kind of dissent for the war. Under federal legislation and similar state laws, authorities arrested about 1,500 pacifists, socialists, industrial workers of the world, leaders, and other critics of the war itself. Under the Espionage Act, Postmaster General, for example, Albert Burleson banned any kind of socialist periodicals from being published or distributed. A patriotic organization called the American Protective League and various local councils of defense claimed some sort of vague governmental authority for further enforcing this kind of ideological conformity. There was a group called the Boy Spies of America who recruited young patriots to try and oppose any kind of dissenting opinion and otherwise enforce ideological conformity. All of this becomes much more intense, especially when the Bolsheviks take over Russia in 1917, and you start to have the early seeds of a communist scare, which comes up especially after the war. There were 3 U.S. Supreme Court decisions handed down in 1919 which upheld the Espionage Act and Sedition Amendments. They generally had to do with the First Amendment guarantee of free speech. And in the most famous of these cases, which we are going to look at specifically in class, is Schoeneck versus the United States. And writing for the unanimous court, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. gives the famous line that where a person's speech poses a clear and present danger to the nation, then it can be legally suppressed. So the First World War severely weakened the progressive reform movement, but it was overall very beneficial to the U.S. economy. Factory output grew by more than a third, civilian workforce expanded by about 1.3 million people, and even unskilled workers saw wage increases by about 20% during the war years. The social impact of the expanded economy took on a variety of forms as well. Job seekers poured into industrial cities very quickly and put a lot of strain on housing, on schools, on municipal services. But you also see a lot of changes in consumption too. If you recall, we looked at propaganda posters asking for the collection of cigarettes to send to soldiers overseas, and the consumption of cigarettes and other tobacco products more than tripled during this period. Automobile manufacturing output also jumped drastically. So in 1914, we were producing about 460,000 automobiles, whereas by 1917, it was about 1.8 million being produced annually. Farmers also profited greatly from the war itself because pretty much all of the Allied forces were relying on American farm products to feed their armies, and so you see huge price jumps in staple crops, especially like cotton and corn and other commodities. And so the real income of the farmers themselves also rose quite dramatically as a result. This was, however, a bit of a mixed blessing. A lot of farmers went very heavily into debt in order to expand their production during the war, so that when the war itself was over and the market stabilizes, you don't have as high of a demand, a lot of them were trapped in crippling debt. And so the 20s are actually a very hard decade for farmers because of their sort of excesses during the war itself. Another part of this expansion of the economy is that you see a massive migration of Black Americans living in the rural South to the urban areas of the North, looking for jobs. In fact, industrial manufacturers actually sent recruiting agents down to the South to get them to come up and fill jobs. Immigrants who had filled those sort of low-paying factory jobs previously weren't coming because of the war in Europe, and so they needed to turn elsewhere for their labor. A lot of them were extremely tempted by this prospect, the idea of getting a job and getting pay in a region where perhaps racism was less oppressive, although that wasn't necessarily always the case. You have profound social ramifications coming from this migration. A lot of churches and storefront missions started to spring up in order to cater to the religious needs of this usually deeply religious population. The NAACP sees a huge leap in the number of local chapters that spring up. Political consciousness of Black Americans is also deeply affected. The war, those who supported the war and served in the military, also supported at home, became convinced that their patriotic involvement would ensure a much quicker establishment of equal citizenship for them in their home country. But this wasn't always the case. They met very severe challenges. White workers resented the competition coming from Black laborers in the North. Homeowners didn't like Black families moving into their neighborhoods, and so lashed out against them. On July 2nd of 1917 in East St. Louis, where a rather large portion of Black laborers moved in, you have a mob of white homeowners who come and start attacking the homes of these Black families. They burn them down, and then as the people inside are running out, they're shooting them, and it's a really awful scene because of this sort of forced mixing of people who didn't mix really before. And so there are some major questions that come out of this with regards to race relations in the United States. The war also had a profound effect on women. Feminist leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt hoped that the war would lead to full equality and greater opportunity for women. The goal seemed attainable for a time at least. Women holding AEF clerical positions, wartime volunteer agencies, and in other wartime areas reached about 1 million. There was also a further group in industry doing jobs. Thousands more held other jobs like streetcar conductors and bricklayers. And all of these are taking up jobs that the men had left behind in order to go fight. A key victory for women's suffrage movement came in November of 1917 when the state of New York amended its constitution in order to permit women to vote. The National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, was picketing the White House at the time, posting banners and criticizing President Wilson for opposing women's suffrage while championing the idea of democracy abroad. Eventually, pressure coming in from all wings, Wilson declared that women's war service had earned them the right to vote, and in 1919, you see the House and the Senate pass the 19th Amendment, and it's ratified about a year later. Beyond that victory, though, the war did very little to better women's actual social position, permanent social position. Relatively few women entered the workforce for the first time during the war years. Many of them simply moved to better paying jobs. Most of them still earned much less than the men that they replaced. And the War Department itself refused any requests for military rank or benefits for women participating in that area. A lot of these wartime gains, however, for women were extremely temporary. At the war's end, a lot of these women lost their jobs to returning veterans. The New York Labor Federation even went so far as to advise that the same patriotism which induced women to enter industry during the war should also induce them to vacate their positions after the war so that the men could take those coming back. Along with the war's other effects, the nation also reeled from an outbreak of influenza in 1918. This is actually a world outbreak, and a lot of it coming from the war itself. Coming from the battlefields and being brought home by soldiers. It killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide. And in 1918, medical science had very few weapons against influenza, and so it was especially deadly. And it's even fairly deadly now. It originates in Africa, actually, and the virus spread very quickly from the battlefields in France to U.S. military training camps, and then very quickly from bases to urban populations where you have a huge concentration of people. The flu hit the cities especially hard. After a September Liberty Loan rally in Philadelphia, for example, doctors reported another 635 new influenza cases coming just from that gathering. A lot of cities began forbidding public gatherings and other measures to try and keep the virus at bay. In total, the U.S. lost about 550,000 people to the influenza, which is about 6 times the number of people who actually died in battle in the war itself. The development of a flu vaccine in the 1940s and of antibiotics to control other infections reduced the severity of later outbreaks, but 1918 was a particularly awful year for the flu. As for progressive era reform and how a lot of the other movements dealt with the war itself, there were some aspects of progressivism that were actually strengthened by the war, and a big part of that was the sort of coercive moral control aspect of progressivism. The drive to prohibit alcohol was aided by the war. Many pointed out that a lot of large breweries had German origins, so they made it sort of patriotic to shut them down. Prohibitionists also hinted that beer was a German plot to undermine American fitness. And then with food conservation being such a high priority, they stressed the wastefulness of using things like grain to make things like liquor. And so the 18th Amendment, which established national prohibition, passed Congress in December of 1917, just after or about 6 months or so after we entered the war. And it was widely seen as a war measure. However, it doesn't actually go into effect until after the war is over in January of 1920. The war also managed to strengthen anti-prostitution campaigns. About $4 million was appropriated to combat venereal disease amongst soldiers and war workers. The War Department also worked to close red light districts in urban areas near military bases under this guise as well. The wartime climate of vigilance and the anti-prostitution drive expanded to a broader policing of morals generally. They urged young unmarried women to practice chastity, with wartime protective bureaus in major cities monitoring women's behavior and sort of checking it if they thought it was getting out of hand. This moral reform activity convinced a lot of people that the traditional codes of sexual behavior, which had been weakening before the war, were being restored. And so I imagine the 20s were a bit of a shock to them later. Labor reforms also advanced during the war. You have the Railroad Administration, the War Labor Board, which encouraged workers to join unions. It guaranteed unions the right to bargain with management. And also pressured factory owners to introduce things like the 8-hour workday, which had been a major part of progressive reform movements. The end of child labor, also a major part of progressivism. And opening their plants to sort of health and safety inspections, also a major part of progressive reforms. Several state legislatures also passed wage and hour laws and other measures that benefited factory workers. The Bureau of War Risk Insurance, created in 1917, was designed to aid soldiers' families and established a precedent for government help for families at risk. And by the war end, there were more than 2 million families receiving regular benefits from this agency. Overall, at least in the short run, the war ultimately weakened a lot of progressive social justice impulses. The stricter regulation of the economy, which was a key progressive goal, were often dominated by business interests. So any regulatory agencies that came out of the war were dominated by businesses. And they were very quickly dismantled after the war. The repression of radicals and anti-war dissenters fractured the fragile coalition of left-leaning progressives and ushered in a decade of sort of reactionism, which we don't actually see another growth of progressive movement until the 1930s, when the Great Depression sort of forces this movement again.